Hello, this presentation is called How Executive Functions and Anxiety Impact Your Educational Journey by Dr. Stephanie Adams. I just want to share a little bit about myself, an introduction for you, and first of all, the biggest thing is First, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. I've been an occupational therapist for about 26 years. My children are very much related to OT as I watch their journey grow. First, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Stephanie, and I have been an occupational therapist for almost 26 years. I am a Missouri girl and always will be a Midwest. First, I want to share a little bit about myself, and as I mentioned, my name is Stephanie Adams. I'm an occupational therapist and have been in the field for about 26 years. I grew up in Missouri and will always be a Midwest girl. However, I am definitely adjusting to the Floridian life and love it down here as I've been here almost 5 years. I'm currently working at Gannon University and teach future occupational therapists in an OTD program and have that joy and opportunity to foster their learning as I love our profession and to be able to give back in that way. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a synopsis about this presentation. So first, there really has been a very big rise in children and youth with the medical diagnosis of anxiety disorders. And when you think about that, executive function challenges can occur. And then really in the end, educational journeys are impacted for those who have these challenges. So what that means in the education world is that educators really have to be able to support these students with the different challenges they may be having within a classroom setting. But children and youth really can have an opportunity to know what their strengths and weaknesses are when you talk about it with them and to be able to use that language with them, and so they learn about executive function and they can connect it with some of the things they do on a daily basis. And this presentation is all about trying to connect the self-awareness piece so students can have an understanding more related to their daily occupations. And this is a presentation that students, educators, and parents would benefit from. So what we will learn today is we are going to talk about the basic information related to executive functions and the components that make up what executive function is in the big picture. We're going to link and explore anxiety and how it works related to executive functions. And we're going to talk a little bit about our own executive functions and how that piece of the puzzle could be more strengthened and identified with learning about ourselves. And then we're going to talk about executive functions related to education and some things that we would help support somebody who has some executive function challenges within education or everyday life occupations. So I want to talk a little bit about executive functions and really how it's defined. So when you look at the literature, it's basically a neurological based skill that we have related to mental control and self-regulation. And it is a set of processes that are all having to do with how we manage things and develop goals and achieve them. And so we also look at how these specific skills help us to manage our daily activities. So when you think about going on a trip, you're going to use a map to get there. And back in the day, we used to have a written map that we could look at, and now we can use an electronic device and use Google to be able to guide us to get to some location. And if that map is a little bit out of sorts, we lose that directionality piece and may not be able to get there. And so then we get lost. And so that's just an example of how executive function works. But basically, it is all of those things that are put together to be able to manage information, be able to really use that information to get to a final goal, and to be able to shift our attention if something comes up, to be able to get that specific thing accomplished. And we practice those skills and we apply them all the time. And so that's just an example of you taking a journey on going somewhere, and if it doesn't go quite as planned and you get lost, then sometimes there are definitely challenges that are impacting everyday life activities. So the research trends on executive functions is related to many different practice areas. First, neuropsychologists and educators were the ones to really forefront the research agenda and to look what was happening with the brain and how executive functions is embedded into the everyday things that we do. So those who have a diagnosis of several of these things, maybe ADHD, autism, ODD, maybe they were born with a low birth rate, they may have some challenges with fine motor or language. All of those things, and especially if you look down a little bit further, it is impacting those everyday skills. And so when you look at research trends on executive functions, the first professionals to actually do research were neuropsychologists and educators. And so what they did was they took the information related to the brain and how and where executive functions is developed, and they started looking at that piece of it related to different diagnoses. And so when you look at the different diagnoses on the left side, any one of these specific diagnoses could be some area of challenges related to having executive function issues. So when you look at the research trends on executive functions, neuropsychologists and educators were definitely, when you look at the research trends on executive functions, neuropsychologists and educators were the forerunners in looking at specifically how executive functions is impacted with different diagnoses. And so when you look at the left side of this slide, there are several different diagnoses listed, and what happens is the person with one of these diagnoses may have executive function challenges. So it doesn't mean that they are in isolation with executive function diagnoses. But so when you look at research trends on executive functions, executive function was first explored by neuropsychologists and educators. They have much more literature on the adult population, and then they move to the adolescent age, and then actually now there is a lot of literature for early childhood on executive function. And so it has many Google hits when you look for the term executive function related to these different age populations. And then the diagnoses that are on the left are any of those diagnoses that could be impacted with executive function challenges. So diagnoses and executive functions. The list here of the different medical conditions, starting with anxiety disorders and looking further at different diagnoses related to attention deficit, born early, having premature birth. When you look at diagnoses and executive functions, any one of these medical conditions that are listed could actually have a potential to have some executive function challenges. And so what happens is it is not a primary diagnosis of executive function disorders, but the medical diagnosis of any one of these listed can diagnoses and executive functions. So this list is different medical conditions that actually are very highly linked to executive function challenges. And so if a person is, for example, diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, they may have some difficulty with executive function, but it depends on the day and it depends on their difficulty related to successfully completing something. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is just to give you an idea that there isn't a specific executive function diagnosis that can be given to anyone. They are just under an umbrella of a medical condition that is a diagnosis. So this particular slide is about the developmental progression of executive functions. And so when you look at it, you see obviously that at year 5, the child is developing executive function. But as you go up the continuum of this arch, it is at least 22 years old that executive function is fully developed. And so it's kind of an interesting slide because it's a very long journey of developing executive functions, and over that continuum, it obviously is very different for everyone that is accomplishing all of these things that we'll talk about more in depth, and to give an understanding of what executive function specifically is. Brain development over time. So this particular picture is pretty cool because it shows that if a child is 5 years old, there's hardly any purple in this particular CAT scan that was taken. And as a child progresses and they go into their late teens, and on the very right, this 20-year-old brain has a lot more blue, purple evident in their brain scan. And so that is obviously a depiction that we know by doing more specific tests, we can see that somebody has a development of executive function. And it is a really neat slide that UCLA has, and they have done research on it specifically, and it is a foundation to give us an idea of how long it takes for executive function to really develop, like I said, as a long continuum of time, and everybody being on a different trajectory of that duration of time. This particular slide shows us where the executive function skills are developed, and it is in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and so it's right there in the front of our brain. And then when you look at the other areas of development, you're looking more at motor and muscle movement and sensory information that goes more toward the back of our brain. And so this gives you an idea if there is damage to that prefrontal cortex, then obviously the executive function skills may be very much impacted. So facts on executive functions. We know that everybody has executive functions. We also know that some executive skills are really much more easier to perform for some than others. And some can be naturally born to have these executive function skills strengths, but then we also know that some of us can have executive function weaknesses, which may impact various activities that we do. But really, individuals vary in their executive function profile. So everybody is different with this. And so we'll talk more about what executive functions is, and you can see how maybe that is interconnected with your own specific strengths and weaknesses. So there are myths and truths related to executive function, and this is a great resource that Erica Warren has developed, and I want to talk a little bit about the myths. So basically, some people think that children with executive function weaknesses are lazy and unmotivated. Well, that's not the case, because maybe it's that they have a hard time starting an activity. Maybe they have a hard time keeping attention to engage with that activity. And so the other ones are just some examples that you can review, and I think that it is a great thing to really think about this, because children with executive function challenges often get misdiagnosis, I guess I should say, and related to. So I want to talk a little bit about myths and truths about executive functioning. And so it definitely is interesting because I think a lot of kids get misdiagnosed, where maybe they were given a medical diagnosis of ADHD. And yes, they could specifically have ADHD, but executive function challenges fall under that specific diagnosis. So they may seem that they are very lazy and unmotivated, or they may have a hard time staying focused on a task. But really, it's more about they may have difficulty initiating the activity, or they may have difficulty with sustained attention, or maybe difficulty with planning the activity. So those are those things that really are interconnected, but they're definitely not a specific truth about executive function. I want to talk a little bit about myth or truth with executive functioning. And so sometimes kids are looked at that they may be struggling with an activity because they have, say, a hard time attending to the activity. Well, it could be that they really just maybe struggle with initiating the activity or planning the activity. And so those are some components of executive function, but not necessarily because they are lazy and then they can't actually, have motivation to be able to do the activity. So it's definitely interesting when you look at these different examples related to a myth or a truth. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about what is executive functions. So executive function is a cluster of different skills, but what they all have in common is that they are all skills we use to execute tasks. So I'm going to give you an example. A daily activity is, I want to go into the kitchen and I want to get a glass of milk. You're going to plan to initiate the task, which means maybe when am I doing that? And then when I decide I want to go into the kitchen, I have to go into a cabinet to pick out a specific glass to use. And then I'm going to go over to the refrigerator. I'm going to pick out the milk, and then I'm going to pour that milk into a glass. I'm going to put the milk back into that refrigerator because otherwise it will go bad. And then I'm going to drink my milk. Either I'm going to stand in the kitchen and drink it, or I'm going to bring it to the table with a meal. So those are several things that have to happen in order to just get one specific task accomplished of drinking milk. So there are 11 components of executive functions. First one, I'm going to go through this particular chart. So there are 11 components of executive functions. So there are 11 components of executive functions. First one is emotional control. Next one is working memory. Number 3 is plan and organize. Number 4 is shift. 5 is response inhibition. 6 is task initiation. 7 is sustained attention. 8, time management. 9, goal directed persistence. 10, metacognition. And the 11th one is, so there are 11 components of executive functions. We're going to start reviewing these individually. And the first one is emotional control, working memory, plan, organize, shift, response inhibition. There are 11 components of executive functions: emotional control, working memory, planning, organization, shift, response inhibition, task initiation, sustained attention, time management, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition. And now we're going to talk individually about each of these so you get the definition and then you can understand them independently of each other. So the development of executive function. This particular chart gives you an idea of how the different executive function skills are developed over a continuum of time. And so when you look at a 6 to 12 month old, these are the things listed that are starting to develop. And the biggest one, I think that to me, you highlighted, you think about response inhibition and emotional control. And so then you move into the 12 to 24 month and you start looking at flexibility and how that child engages with others and playing with peers. And then you move into the preschool and elementary age. And now you're talking about how do kids really organize and plan play, and how are they doing with completing an activity from maybe start to finish. And then you go into middle school and higher, and you're looking at metacognition. And so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically of these things, and you can have that understanding of them as we learn more about executive function specifically. So shift. When you are actually doing a specific activity, you have the ability to maybe move from one situation to another, be able to adjust and have flexibility. And so then first executive function we're going to talk about is shift. This is being able to move from one situation to another, make transitions, solve problems. And so flexibility is a key here. When things are maybe not what you expect, are you able to shift to be able to go on to another activity smoothly and to be able to refocus on something that maybe was not expected? Emotional control. This is when you are able to manage your feelings so that they don't get in the way of getting something completed. And so your appropriate emotional response is going to be very important. And so you don't get very frustrated, and you got so frustrated you have a meltdown and then you can't complete that activity. But having the right emotion connected to a specific task is very important in the accomplishment of executive function skills. Planning. Planning is your road map. This is your GPS for you to be able to have a really good, solid plan. So we like to think of it as, you know, all the turns that you're going to need to make during that journey, and how do you get past those roadblocks along the way? Because there's always going to be those challenges that pop up. And so how can you continue to complete that activity but yet have a really good solid plan when maybe something doesn't go specifically as expected? And then really let go of those little things. You know, some of those things may be really big when you're trying to plan something, but yet some things may not be. And so how do you just kind of move forward and deal with the challenges that you may be faced with? Organization. This is having a specific system set up for keeping track of information and materials, especially those things that you're going to use every day. And so those could be your phone, your keys to your car, maybe a homework folder, making sure that you have a place for those so that when you go to find them, you're very efficient with your time and you can locate the item and move forward with what you need to get done. And that everything really kind of has a place in your home. And so then that makes your environment much more conducive to being a little bit more effective with taking time for other things that you need if you have everything very much organized. Response inhibition. So this is really being able to control your impulses so you can think before you act, stop and modulate behavior at the right time, resist peer pressure, possibly, and really just in the end, make good choices. And so this is very important to be able to process information and don't react so quickly, but yet when you do make a decision to react, making those choices that are the right ones, I guess. Task initiation, being able to make yourself start a task. This can be hard sometimes, but this is one of those skills that really can be taught. And so if you choose to start task initiation, being able to make yourself start a task. This is a tough skill to learn. And if you see yourself getting closer to your goal, it's definitely that first step on that pathway. And so sometimes, for example, kids have a hard time starting their homework. So initiating that first problem on that math worksheet may be a little bit difficult. But once they get that first one finished, and then they do another one, and as they complete them, they're feeling more successful. They're going to see the progression toward their goal of completing that handout. And so it definitely is not always easy for some, and so others may need encouragement, but being in the supportive role if somebody is having a difficult time, encouraging them to get that very first one completed and then move forward, it is definitely something that is accomplishable. Task initiation, being able to make yourself start a task. This is a tough skill to learn. And so an example would be if a child has a math worksheet of, say, 10 problems, and they really struggle with this particular type of math problem. They may have a hard time getting started with that first one. But once they get that first one completed, and hopefully it's correct, they can move on to the next one. And as they go through that process and have accomplishments in learning about it, even if it is the wrong answer, then they can move forward with getting those 10 particular problems completed. And so once you see yourself getting closer to that goal, it's a lot easier to keep going. But that very first problem sometimes is a little bit more of a struggle for some to get started than others. Sustained attention, staying on task, really being able to get things done in the time that you're given yourself to complete them. You know, if you become tired or you become bored, there's always those distractions that come up that we may want to walk away from completing something. But if we know that we need to get it completed, we may be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel to be able to actually get sustained attention. Basically, this is just staying on task. Really being able to get things done when you're giving a time frame to get that particular task completed. So even if you get tired or bored, or there's distractions that kind of pop up, like maybe looking at our cell phone when we know we're not supposed to be on social media, but really having the ability to keep that attention and focus to be able to get that particular task completed. Time management. This allows us to be able to manage that tug of war between what you want to do, what you need to do, and maybe what others ask you to do. So an example is when you're in an office and all of a sudden a particular coworker comes up to ask you to look at a particular project. Well, you've already been working on a different project and that was your goal for that day. But then you have to decide how to manage that time. Is it going to be okay that you step away from your original project you're working on and address your coworker's question to be able to help support another project that's happening as well. And so really just how to balance that time. And really the key piece of this is the ability to estimate how long it takes to do something. So I chuckle because I think when you really do something at the last minute, it's probably a little bit more stressful because you haven't allowed yourself to have enough time to be able to complete it. And so then your deadline is coming up and there's a lot of things that maybe can come up and sidetrack us. And so if you are leaving something to the last minute, that may be a problem because then you're not able to deal with the other stuff that comes up in the meantime. So time management is definitely a work in progress for most. Goal-directed persistence. This is a giant version of sustained attention. This really specifically is related to making a goal and then being able to really to get there. You are motivated, you have perseverance, and you are determined to make this goal become an accomplishment for yourself. And it takes a long time for some of these goals, and some are a little bit shorter. So it depends on what that goal is, but really being able to focus upon getting it done and feeling that it was accomplished in a manner that you had expected. Metacognition. This is your brain's life lesson machine. It allows you to reflect on past actions, experiences, and look at it in the respect of how did it go? What did I do? Why did I do that? And really maybe what would I do differently next time? Really that reflection piece of the successes and maybe challenges related to a specific activity and learning from that particular experience. 2 dimensions of executive function skills. So thinking and cognition is one area of executive function, and it is interconnected with working memory, planning, organization, time management, and metacognition. And the other component of that is the doing or the actual behaviors, which is more specifically related to response inhibition, emotional control, sustained attention, task initiation, goal-directed persistence, and flexibility. So of the 11 particular executive function skills we talked about several slides ago, this is broken down a little bit differently because it's talking about the thinking and cognition pieces of executive function and dividing that out and looking at the doing and the behaviors related to executive function skills. So this is the part of the presentation we're going to talk and connect anxiety with executive functions. And so first, when we talk about anxiety, we're going to talk about the definition of it. And so anxiety actually is a normal reaction to stress, and it can be very beneficial in some situations. But typically, it's an anticipation of a future concern. Most of the time, when we are having an increase in anxiety, we're thinking about something that really we may not have control over, and it could be something that's on the road. It's not specifically today, but it's something that's coming up tomorrow or later, and it is something we're thinking about and maybe what the outcome will be. And with that, we may be having some muscle tension issues, or we may have some avoidance behaviors where we're just not wanting to do something because we have the anxiety piece that's connected with the other part of it is fear and our emotional response to that, which could be that fight or flight. And so we know that we need to do something, but boy, we just get so anxious and upset about it. We just, move on and we try to steer away from that particular situation. And then really it can be a combination of factors. Could be that you have some genetics related to anxiety, and it could be some environmental things or psychological or developmental, and so those different things can impact anxiety at different levels, which is obviously impacting everybody at a different stage. The other piece of this is facts about anxiety. And so when you look at anxiety and you start to research the particular topic, there are a lot of diagnoses of people with anxiety, and it is one of the most common mental illnesses in the United States. It affects at least 25% of children between the ages of 13 to 18, and the disorder is actually treatable. Yet there are at least 36% of the people who only receive treatment, and so there's a lot of people out there who are not receiving specific help relating to anxiety. Anxiety and depression are commonly linked, and that is more so now that research is impacted and knowing that it is interconnected, and other kind of types of anxiety could be more of phobias or social anxiety, or maybe some panic attacks, or maybe separation away from somebody else you're most comfortable with. And so those are some other things that can be happening on an everyday basis that impacts completion of activities. So I like these particular infographic pictures, and I wanted to put these in the presentation. So this is just about identifying anxiety signs. The picture on the left is really those psychosocial or those physiological things that are happening in our system, and those are can be pretty heightened, and so you start to really start to have a stomach ache. You may start to stress, so identifying anxiety signs. I wanted to include two specific infographic pictures because they are really neat, because they do a great job at summarizing things related to anxiety. And so on the left side, it's basically those physiological changes that are happening, where we may end up having our heart race, we may have a stomach problem, we may end up sweating and having a headache. And so some of those really things that we are not in control of, and if we are having increased anxiety, those things just start to occur naturally. But I think it's interesting when you look at the pictures on the right, we're talking about more specifically related to what challenges are happening in everyday activities. So we may have difficulty sleeping. We may feel really agitated and angry very quickly. We may have a hard time paying attention and focusing to a specific conversation. Or we may just have difficulty planning or really starting our day and being organized to make it successful as we accomplish things one thing at a time. So there are many different things that can happen related to anxiety, and that affects our occupational performance. So this particular slide really gives a good picture of anxiety related to executive function and how they are interconnected. And so if you remember earlier, we talked about the thinking and cognition and the doing and behavior executive functions. And so they're listed on the left as a reminder. And when you look at the picture on the right, you can see that anxiety is going to impact all of us in different ways, but the psychological piece of that, things that we just mentioned in the previous slide, but then also when you look at the cognition piece of it, that maybe that what if, and like if it happens, then I'm not going to get the job that I want, or I'm not going to get an A in the class because I'm working so hard. So some of those cognitive things that we give us that self-talk, which impacts us. And so then, of course, our emotions and behaviors can be interrelated to that too. And so If we have an increase of fear, then we may have behaviors that were maybe specifically avoiding an activity, which we really don't have choice. We should be getting it completed, but our emotions are standing in the way. So this is a great opportunity to reflect about executive function anxiety and how it can be a negative thing that it make it harder to accomplish something. So executive function anxiety. When you look at this picture, you're going to look at the bottom, and the spiral here is those emotions. So this slide reviews executive function and anxiety again. I thought this graphic picture was awesome because it really gives you a snapshot of the entire executive function related to the impact that anxiety can have on so this particular slide talks about executive function and anxiety. So when you look at the bottom, you're looking at the survival center, and this, as we mentioned, is that fight or flight response. So infants actually depend on that caretaker to help support them, and as we get a little older, we're able to do this on our own. This is definitely something that has to be learned as we get experiences with the world. Then you move up and you look at the emotional center. This is all about our emotions and our feelings that are related to everything we do along. And this is with the limbic system. And so some of this we can control, but some of it very could be a response to something really quickly. And so then that impulse control is a challenge. And so we may have to learn that in order to act so spontaneously. And next is the center. And this again is where we talk about the cognition of it, that actual thinking brain. How we want to develop all those executive function skills to the best that we can, because then we are efficient with our the activities we do. We'll talk about how we identify our own executive functions and what are our executive strengths. So let's talk about identifying executive functions. So how we look specifically at our own functions is using different assessment tools. And because there are so many out there, and this presentation has a limit per se, I wanted to just briefly cover the different types of assessments. And so for informal measures, there are some formal assessments, there's rating and there's performance assessment. So an informal measure, this is basically where a teacher or a counselor, therapist would interview a parent, teacher, and so we would ask questions more related to occupation, more specifically about how a child is performing homework, doing with their activities of daily living, bathing, dressing, sleeping, how are they interacting with others socially. And so then more if you're looking at asking questions toward education, you would talk to a teacher about how that child is performing in the classroom, getting their work did, are they doing it in a timely manner, do they follow the rules within a school setting. These are basically open-ended questions that to kind of give a real understanding of how a child is on a daily basis. So because there are so many types of formal assessments and ratings, I decided to just put a example. And so formal assessments are mostly very research and clinic based. Let's see the left side of the slide. And then the ratings are much more popular And the biggest, we call the gold standard, is, and this is a peer inventory of its function. It's most commonly, so it's a sections that a person who knows that really well would complete. It identifies strengths and weaknesses on a scale, and so it gives details about if they're struggling with executive function, maybe organization, for example. And so it's just a variety of different assessment scales that are available. Assessment. This particular information is beneficial to therapists who want a child to perform something as therapists most of the time talk about the doing engagement in an activity. These particular assessments are actually free, and you can go on the site, and the link is at the bottom, and it's just an assessment that has the so talk about assessment as an occupational is very, and that want to be someone. These particular assessments are free and they're available on sites that are good. And these particular differences of the person engaging in that, you are rating them with form. You are able to look at strengths and weaknesses. Washington is has some very research on function, and these are can be downloaded for cost how the child is practicing function. There's several in the present because they are excellent and use these courses. We provide really great research. One of these is that you book and you now we function in possible to and the child report after reading the book. The teacher to actually teach to have readiness skills upon entering kindergarten. So traditionally, readiness skills related to academic performance and understanding institutional policies. Research has shown that teachers are really focused on kids being able to perform different types of skills within the classroom. So what I mean by that is they can teach academic skills. And the most difficult thing for them to teach is the social emotional piece to it, or some of those executive function challenges. So it's a journey for them to be able to get all this. Executive functions in education. So as we mentioned, executive functions is developed at the youngest age of 2. And so preschoolers are really expected to have some of these readiness skills when they transition into kindergarten. So readiness skills are related to different things. And so it could be academic, physical, motor, emotional, and social skills. And so research is making the connection that teachers really prefer for kids to have strong executive function skills when they're entering kindergarten, even more importantly than education, the academic piece, because they can teach that. That's what they're there for, to have the students learn about different subjects. And so this, I thought, was just very relevant to make that connection with education. So we're going to talk a little bit about intervention methods to enhance executive function. There are 2 different areas that can be focused on. The external, which is possibly changing the environment or providing external cues, or internal, which would be trying to change the child to be able to enhance their abilities and possibly provide some self-cues, that internal piece of that higher level metacognition abilities. So we're going to address some of the external solutions that parents and educators could possibly use to help support a student who is struggling with some executive function challenges. Basically, by modifying the environment, several of these things could be implemented. Maybe changing the physical setup of the room, maybe limiting social interaction during an activity, modifying the task with less components to complete, maybe really having a specific timeline developed, maybe helping the student understand and prioritize the components of the project, maybe providing a one-step direction at a time, providing some visual cues, or start the task with the child and then have them join after a few steps. So some internal solutions that may be utilized. When you look at the specific child, if you're providing open-ended tasks for them to be successful, so they're able to have multiple correct answers, so not just one definitive answer. The task has no starting point, and then the actual time is not specific for completion, so there is no deadline for it. But if you're trying to change the child to internally build some self-cues, you may do some things more related to practicing things in a sequenced order. You may have something like complete a word problem step by step, or create words out of separate letter blocks. Follow a recipe to be able to make a snack. So something more specific that requires a step 1 to 10. And if you don't do those, or you miss something, then there's an error, and then they have to figure it out and to be able to self-correct and learn those different things. So on the previous 2 slides, I mentioned some just very general things that you can do to help support a child who has some executive function challenges. This is a great infographic again that talks about some more specific things related to scheduling and using calendars and having specific time frames, and actually as well as movement during activities. And so using this as a guide that may give you some examples. We just touched a little bit on this particular section, and so there is much more that can be explored, and there are many more resources out there that have some great authors and researchers that have talked about executive function that may be of interest for you to add those type of books into your library as well. So here is just a picture of a few of the books I have in my library related to executive function. So I wanted to add those so you have those titles of the books so you could possibly, like I mentioned, have in your future library. So I decided to add this particular slide because there are many experts on executive function, as I have mentioned, and there are websites available for you here on this slide that you can dive into this topic a little bit more if that's of interest to you. And so this is some really good resources for your future. The next two slides. So this is a list of my references. I actually have an extended reference list as well, but wanted to make sure that I highlighted the ones that I did cover specifically in this particular presentation for you. This is a slide that includes many of the different websites that are also have some fantastic information about executive function. I just wanted to tell you thank you for visiting my presentation, and I hope that you were able to learn a lot, but I also hope that you had the opportunity to find a little bit of curiosity to learn even more about executive function. And I am I'd like to thank you for joining my presentation today. It was a pleasure to be able to give you as much information as I could in a short time period. I'd like to leave you with my contact information, and if you have any more thoughts or curiosity or questions, I certainly would be honored to be able to have a conversation with you. So please reach out to me, and I hope you have a good rest of your particular So I'm leaving you today with my contact information, and I hope you found this presentation very valuable and that it sparked an interest. And if you have any questions and would like to have a conversation more personally about executive function, I would be honored to be able to have that opportunity with you. Thank you so much.